Welcome back to another Phasmophobia video, and today I wanted to do a detailed ranking of all optional equipment, and this is going to be very similar to my map ranking video where there's the different categories and there's going to be scoring for each, and this isn't going to include every tier of every item, but I will make some exceptions for items if they're unique or different enough. These exceptions are going to be the tier 2 and 3 UV, every tier of the Smudge Stick, tier 2 and 3 of the motion sensor, and tier 2 and 3 of the headgear. I don't want to include every tier of every item as a lot of them are just direct upgrades to their former tiers. And also just assume each item I talk about is going to be tier 3 unless it's specified otherwise. Some could argue I can include more exceptions, but I don't want to go over everything that has a super niche or negligible difference, and I don't want this video to be too long. And just before I go over each category, if you find this video helpful, please consider leaving a comment, liking, or even subscribing. So for categories, our first one is effectiveness. And it's not necessarily how good the item is itself, but more so the ability to fulfill its intended purpose. For example, something like the Crucifix fulfills its purpose well. Its goal is to protect the player and prevent hunts, and the tier 3 Crucifix has a decent range and 2 charges, thus making it effective in that regard, while something like the sound sensor has somewhat of a poor effectiveness, as its goal is to relay additional information to the ghost hunters and maybe even possibly locate the ghost, but it's pretty counterproductive as you have to wait around in the truck to monitor it, plus it's not very specific, therefore the sound sensor is somewhat bad at fulfilling its purpose at relaying additional information. Next we have Versatility, which is pretty straightforward. How useful is an item overall, and is the item useful in a broad sense? Does it only have one specific use? Are there more unconventional uses for this item? Next we have Impact, which is how much does this item affect the game? Does it provide valuable information? How significant is this item? Does this item change the course of the investigation? Next we have Fun, and pretty self-explanatory, just how fun is this item to use? And then the final category is Arbitrary Points. And is there anything else worth mentioning about these items that might not necessarily fit in a general category? And each category will be scored with 1 out of 5 being the lowest and 5 out of 5 being the best and highest. And the lowest total points a piece of equipment can get is 5 out of 25, and the highest is obviously 25 out of 25. An important note is that some categories and points are things beyond gameplay loop, like how fun something might be to use, so this list isn't necessarily a true best item rank in terms of gameplay, but it's somewhat close to reflecting one, so don't be surprised if you see something that seems too low or maybe too high. And just a reminder, this is every piece of equipment that's labeled as optional, and then there's also going to be the exceptions for the tiers that I mentioned earlier. And we're going to go from lowest to highest, and to no surprise, the lowest is going to be the sound sensor. It's honestly hard to find things to mention for the sound sensor that are positives. I find the sound sensor to be inherently flawed as it requires you to spend a lot of time in the van, and locating the exact location of the sound is also going to be very hard unless you're on a small map. It's just simply not that great of an item. I feel like it's a worse and stationary version of a parabolic microphone. Although you can utilize the sound sensor from the truck, I just don't find it to be worth using. It gets a little bit of credit on bigger maps, but even then it's still very weak. Next we have the tripod, and I feel like there's not much to be said about the tripod, as it just does its job. It helps when combining with the video camera for watching for evidence interactions from the truck, or maybe even things like Goryo dots. So it gets some credit for fulfilling its role in assisting information collection. It's not necessarily bad, but just doesn't do anything beyond assisting the video camera. And yeah, it's just a tripod. Next we have the tier 2 headgear. And honestly, this item isn't really that bad, and it can be nice in a lot of situations. When I'm on bigger maps and drop my flashlight in the ghost room, I just like to bring one of these with me. And although the night vision with tier 3 is technically a direct upgrade to this, I still think the tier 2 has its uses despite its lower score, and I feel like it's really not as bad as people think. This next item might upset some people that it's this low on the list, but I'm gonna have to put the tier 3 Smudge Stick here. I really just never used the tier 3 Smudge Stick over the tier 2. And yes, any smudge is good, but I feel like stopping the ghost completely actually has some downsides. Sometimes it can be harder to get away from the ghost, it'll throw off the speed of the ghost. It's not necessarily a bad item. I personally just don't really like it that much. Next, we have the Tier 3 motion sensor. Now, this is a pretty straightforward item. It's great for knocking out the objective and even tracking the ghost location. However, I personally just prefer the Tier 2 a bit more, as the cone shape the Tier 2 has makes it easy to track the direction the ghost is moving in, which I think is a very underrated thing to do. And it's not a bad item. I personally just prefer the Tier 2. The next item is going to be the Firelight. And I feel like this item does its job well, as the Tier 3 Firelight is a lantern. It has decent visibility, all things considered. However, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that impactful to overall gameplay. It gets a bit of credit since it can be used to test for an Onryo and help prevent sanity drain. And I personally do kind of like the light that the lantern emits. It's kind of nice, but not something necessarily I'd rely on. Next, we have the Tier 2 motion sensor. And the cone shape the Tier 2 motion sensor has is really amazing. Tracking ghost movement is great, and I love setting up one or two of these just to know where the ghost is roaming. Even beyond just getting the objective done, it's great for knowing where the ghost is, especially later into the game. Pinpointing where the ghost could potentially hunt from is actually really huge. So if you're ever wondering who's taking all of your motion sensors and setting them up everywhere, it's probably me. Next, we have Sanity Meds, and although not necessarily versatile, Sanity Meds have a huge impact on the game. I feel like it gives you a lot of control over something you normally don't have much control over, more specifically your sanity. Even though you can stay in the light to prevent your sanity drain, there are some maps where it's simply impossible to guarantee, and also considering a lot of ghost abilities affect your sanity, this item is really strong. Next, we have the Tier 3 headgear, and the Tier 3 headgear is just very useful and convenient. And although I don't use it all the time, it's nice to just have. And it's not overly annoying either, since you can just turn it off and on whenever you want, and it doesn't take up an inventory slot. I'm someone who does prefer a flashlight at the end of the day, but the night vision is a very strong item that is useful, makes navigating bigger maps easy, and is just very convenient. Next, we have the lighter, which might be a bit of a surprise, but it's very straightforward and helpful for many things. And although on its own, it's not very useful for anything, it is required for smudges, firelights, and is fun to light the summoning circle and campfires on maps too. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a lighter, but is necessary for some of the most important items in the game like smudges, and it has its own inventory slot, so you're always just going to have one on you, and it's needed for good items. Next, we have the Crucifix, and the Crucifix is obviously very useful, and it does its intended job well. And although it might not necessarily be versatile, I would say the Crucifix is very important for many reasons, and I would even say this item is a necessity for every single investigation. It's just a powerful item that is necessary to survive each game, which is obviously the most important thing. The next item we have is the Tier 1 Smudge Stick. And the Tier 1 is great, and I know a lot of people even prefer it over the Tier 2 and 3, but I still prefer the Tier 2. The Tier 1 smudge is nice as it doesn't affect the ghost movement speed whenever you smudge it during a hunt. And every smudge is obviously crucial for survival, testing ghost abilities, and is just a great item for obvious reasons. This next item is probably one of my favorite to use in the game, and it's the Parabolic Microphone. It's pretty straightforward and fun to use. It's one of the most versatile items in the game in my opinion, as you can use it to locate the ghost room, listen to interactions, testing for the banshee, and the small screen makes it easy to see specifically where the sound came from and what floor. I'd say it's a necessity on bigger maps and is really just fun to use as it's so unique compared to the other items. This next item is another one of my favorites, and it's going to be the photo camera. It's a straightforward piece of equipment, and although it's kind of useless outside of the photo mechanics for the most part, I do think it's one of the most important items in the game, as photos are required for a perfect investigation bonus, which is a massive bonus to XP and money, and you can also use it to test for a phantom. And I know I'm biased as I'm always the one taking all the photos, but I think it's just a unique mechanic that's way different from things like collecting evidence or using an item to test for a ghost ability. It's just really fun, and the bonuses are huge if done right. This next item might surprise people for being so high, but I'm gonna have to say salt. Salt is the most versatile thing in the game in my opinion. It can be used to track ghost movement, test for UV, test for wraith, and it's great for getting photos as well. And salt is essentially a get out of jail free card for photos. Although I do like just naturally taking photos of interactions or going for the ghost photo, some ghosts simply don't interact with a lot, and salt is just an easy way to fill the book up. It's also honestly essential for testing for UV, especially on bigger maps, or even maps where you're outside where there's no doors or things for UV to even come up on naturally. Imagine trying to get UV without salt in the gym on high school. Every single time I test for UV, I'm usually bringing salt with me. It's nice to get a free few photos, and hopefully the ghost doesn't turn out to be a wraith and kill me. And finally, we have the tier 2 Smudge Stick. This is my favorite smudge, as I find it easy to control the ghost while ensuring I survive. I think the slowdown with the ghost is okay too, as the ghost usually walks away from the player, and it's also nice to have an auditory indication of when the smudge effect wears off, unlike the tier 1. And this just goes for every smudge, but obviously it's just the #1 tool in surviving. Great for testing different ghosts, great for preventing a hunt, great for surviving a hunt. It's just the most important item in the game in my opinion. And at the end of the day, most of the items in this game are very good, despite some being ranked over others. A lot of these items scored very high. I'd say the only real margin was the sound sensor, which scored 8 out of 25, and the next item was a 15 out of 25. So even though I have things like Smudge Stick tier 3 ranked relatively low, it did get a 15 out of 25, meaning it's actually a pretty decent item all things considered. And even things like Sanity Meds, which was around the middle of this list, however it got a 19 out of 25. So just because some of these items are lower on the list doesn't mean it's bad. Again, I think really the only true bad item in this game is a sound sensor. And here's a very rough tier list, and some of these items are switched around, but really most of these items are pretty good. Again, the sound sensor is just so low, I feel like it's not that great, and the only reason a tripod is in C as it really only functions with a video camera, and then everything else is pretty high and worth using. And I'll just show you this spreadsheet of all the items and the rankings and scorings and whatnot. So let me know how you feel about this. If you like this list or think it's probably the worst takes you've ever seen, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much for watching.